and welcome. We are in Junior English and back again now, having conversation with the great American poet Walt Whitman. Now, in our earlier conversations in regards to Song of Myself, I'm with you now on page 428, 429, we talked about Whitman as the great iconoclast. That is to say, the individual who is always pushing against the bounds of poetic understandings and, of course, what you are supposed to be allowed to say in poems. Now, can I just point out for a moment, and we're turning now to Song of Myself, passage 1-4 on page 429. Can I just say for a moment how difficult it is for an anthology company, that is to say the people who made this book, to decide what passages from Song of Myself you're going to include. Anyone that would make an American literature volume for high school students or college students knows that you have to include Walt Whitman. And in fact, we would say Whitman is probably the fulcrum or the center voice of all of the voices of the American literary tradition. Certainly, Whitman is going to stand poetically at the very center. Many will argue, though, that Whitman is really the voice of the American literary tradition. There is everything that happens before Whitman, and then there's everything that happens after Whitman, and Whitman himself kind of stands or serves as that kind of center point. So the question is, if he is that important, and you can't put everything that he wrote inside of an anthology, obviously you can't, then you become really challenged to know which passages you're going to extract and put inside of the anthology. Your textbook company has selected obviously one, passage 6 as we've already talked about, because that one is going to explain probably more than any other single passage this idea why he called it Leaves of Grass. A child came to me asking what is the grass. But then they decide to work with passages 9 and 14, and then over onto page 430, passage 17, before finally getting to the final passages of 51-52, which are usually included in anthologies. We may ask why, for example, passage 14 is at all going to be included in an anthology offering. Let's take a look now at the passage itself and just remind ourselves. Leaves of Grass is the volume that Whitman published at least 6 times in his life, and in 1892, when he dies, is still working on it. This volume, Leaves of Grass, is published in 1855 for the first time with a long poem called Song of Myself. Song of Myself is subdivided into numbers of poems, starting at 1, ending at 52. These poems sometimes are kind of connected, but they really are standalone poems. So when we look, for example, at passage 14, we are looking at a standalone poem. Now, let's talk about Whitman as the great projector, or eye. He is going to look at things and record those things on paper. And in passage 14, we're going to see this. He's also the great lister. He likes lists. I'd write that down in 2B. Whitman likes lists. We're working with the word diction today as we work at 2B, but we'll also talk about Whitman's poetic project as being one of often lists. He is the great eye. He likes to look and try and answer this question. What is an American? Who is an American? And for Whitman, he is very, as we've already said, inclusive in his view. Instead of excluding people and saying, oh, no, you're not an American, Whitman is the great enfolder of everything that's happening in America at the time, from 1855 to 1892. And because of this, we're going to see that his poetry has a tremendous range, all over the place. Let's take a look at his love of nature. So we'll write that one down at level 1. His love of nature and all the amazing things that it means in terms of nature when we start talking about what is America. Now, Whitman published a volume called Specimen Days. Specimen Days. I'm working at 3A now. Whitman published a volume called Specimen Days, in which he took passages from his journaling and publish those passages. The first 100 pages or so of Specimen Days is his reflections on what it was like to be alive during the American Civil War. I'll have more to say about that here in another lecture. The second part of his Specimen Days is simply musings on nature, where he derives a lot of his poetic energy from nature itself. See, I have the tree planted outside in the courtyard that we call Ruthie's tree because Ruthie planted it for me many, many years ago, our janitor. And I often will reference this tree as an icon or a symbol of nature. Most of my students look at the tree as just a tree. Whitman will remind us there's something quite remarkable about that tree. We ask questions like, for example, how did it know how to grow itself? To know how to look like that, as opposed to, for example, a Christmas tree, evergreen tree, a pine tree. How did it know that? When did it go to school to learn how to grow itself so that it would look like that? How do you account for the fact that during the dead of winter, that thing looks dead? And in fact, you would say, oh, let's get out the axe or the saw and cut it down. And you would say, no, you don't understand. It looks dead, but it's not dead. No, it is dead. Look, there's no leaves on it. No, I know you think it's dead, but it's actually alive. It's gone into a dormant phase. And here in about 120 days, it's going to wake up again, and it's going to sprout green leaves, and it's going to, and you go, well, how did it know how to do that? Like, who taught it how to do that? See, it's funny how I can ask a question like this that sounds like a little kindergarten question, and then you all of a sudden have to come up with an answer, and you go, what do you mean, how did it know? Trees don't know, they just do. What do you mean they just do? Do how? Like, who taught it how to do that? No, you don't understand. It is in its nature to do that. Which begs a really interesting question. How did you know how to grow yourself? What do you mean, how did I grow myself? My body just grows. I understand that your body just grows unless there's some pathology or disease or illness, but how did it know how to do that? Now all of a sudden, we start to get the word LAW that will begin to inject itself into our conversation. Law, the law of nature, the rhythm of nature, the understandings of nature. For Whitman as a poet, and a sensitive one at that, this kind of question is no throwaway question at all. How do you account for the fact that this morning on your way here to school, you passed by bunches of these trees? Where'd they come from? Some of them were planted, many of them were not. How did they know how to grow and how to become what they are? And then, of course, there's all kinds of wonderful things that our biologists will tell us, like, for example, for every bit of tree you see above the ground, there is that much and more, where? Under the ground. Whoa, it says something. For example, those big redwood trees that grow in the forests of Northern California, that grow to hundreds and hundreds of feet. If they're that big above the ground, what are they under the ground? Whoa, see? So we have very interesting understandings about nature that Whitman won't let alone. He'll come back to it over and over again. Let me give you an example. Passage 14. Read it with me. I'm on 429 together. The wild gander. By the way, we should point out, Whitman loves birds. He loves birds. So he'll go for walks out into the woods, and he'll pay attention to birds. The wild gander leads his flock through the cool night. Ye honk, he says, and sounds it down to me like an invitation. The pert may suppose it meaningless, but I, listening close, find its purpose and place up there toward the wintry sky. The sharp-hooved moose of the north, the cat on the house sill, the chickadee, the prairie dog, the litter of the grunting sow as they tug at her teats, the brood of the turkey hen, and she with her half-spread wings, I see in them and myself the same old law. The press of my foot to the earth springs 100 affections. They scorn the best I can do to relate them. I am enamored of growing outdoors, of men that live among cattle, or taste of the ocean or woods, of the builders and steerers of ships, and the wielders of axes and mauls, and the drivers of horses. I can eat and sleep with them week in and week out. What is commonest, cheapest, nearest, easiest is me. Me going in for my chances, spending for vast returns, adorning myself to bestow myself on the first that will take me, not asking the sky to come down to my goodwill, scattering it freely forever. Let's exegete quickly. It's a simple passage and yet a complex passage if we know how to read it. Notice first of all that Whitman, as I said, the great lister at level 1, notice where his eye falls in regards to stanzas. So I'm with you on page 429 to begin. Notice he begins with the wild gander, a bird. And he imagines that the bird is somehow speaking to him, even though others might go, yeah, right, birds don't speak to you. He says, I don't know about that. Nature is a very interesting thing. Who knows if birds maybe are speaking directly to me. Notice he says in the second stanza, he's very interested in other animals. The moose of the north. We, of course, live in a place where we get to see these every once in a while, especially if we travel through Yellowstone, right? The cat, the chickadee, the prairie dog, the small pigs that are going to be eating at mother's teats, the hen, the turkey hen with the spread out wings. Notice what he says about all of these in his list. Last line on page 429, last line of second stanza. He says, I see in them and myself the same old law. And it's here, of course, we're going to write down at 2a, an important message of this poem, aren't we? Whitman is going to argue that if you see any small part of nature, you have seen all of nature. And more particularly, that old law, which abides both in you and in Ruthie's tree. We have had this existential conversation before in 303. When you look at Ruthie's tree, write down what for you is fundamentally different from that tree. See, and some of you will say, well, that's the stupidest question I ever heard. I'm a human and it's a tree. No. You didn't get the word fundamentally different. Because the last time that we spoke with a biologist, he or she reminded us that both you and that tree are made up of molecules. What makes you so different from that tree? Well, I have the ability to move, you might say. And the tree might respond if it could talk, and I have the ability not to. I can stand still for a whole lot longer than you. What makes you think that your potentiality of movement is better than my potentiality of stillness? But if you talk to a biologist, the tree might say, I'm not still. I am in constant movement because of my fundamental composition. I am made up of molecules and atoms that are in constant movement. Were you not awake during biology class? Didn't they tell you this? That fundamentally you're made up of cells that are constantly moving. There is no stillness in a tree. It only appears that way to you. And the tree might say, now, which one's smart and which one's stupid? Really? You're that much different from me. Keep going. This is this old law of nature. And for Whitman, he's impressed by this. It makes him think. Notice he continues by making the observation in the third stanza that every time he walks on the earth, on the ground, right, that there's all kinds of observations that get made for him that he cannot put into words. Look at the top of 430. He says, and some of us will say this out loud, I am enamored. I love, he says, growing outdoors. Some of you would say, if you really want to improve school, then get us out of this stupid building. Put us outside somewhere. I have ball players that say, especially if they play ball outside, not in the gym, outside, they will say, the best education is on a baseball diamond. That's where you really learn about life. Put us out there and let us learn how to live our lives outdoors. Some of you will say, best education you could have is to work on a farm. Just put somebody on a farm and make them learn the rhythms of early morning rising, early morning sleeping, and let's put it somewhere where there's no cell service. After several months of that experience, you might start thinking differently about this thing called life. Whitman is tuned into this idea. He continues, he said, I'm enamored of living outdoors. He says, I love to think about men who work with cattle or who work on the ocean or the woods, the builders and steerers of ships, the wielders of axes, the drivers of horses. Let's just say this out loud. He says, I can eat and sleep with them week in and week out. Let's just say this out loud. Whitman loves blue-collar workers, we call them today. People who know how to work with their hands. People who know what real work is. People who get up in the morning and they go and sweat all day long in their work and then come home exhausted. Whitman says, those people I love. He said, I can be with them all day long. He says in the final stanza, I don't just like what's amazing and great, what everybody thinks is important, the expensive. Look what he says. I like what's common, cheap, nearest, easiest. All of it, he says, is me. And the one thing I would point out at line 15 of this poem is notice that me is capitalized. I would definitely write that down in your notes. Me here, not small case m, uppercase M, me representing the human race. In other words, there is no distinctions for Whitman between people who carry a lunchbox to work and people who are driven by a driver and a chauffeur in a limo. For Whitman, they're both people who work. Work for Whitman is sacred because work is done by the worker. And all of us contribute to that as Americans, he says. He says about himself, going in for my chances, spending for vast returns, taking risks, adorning myself to bestow myself on the first that will take me, not asking the sky to come down to my goodwill. This is Whitman's jab, maybe, for example, at certain religious views that say, I'm always asking some kind of deity to change the world I live in and somehow make it different. And he says, I'm not interested in the sky coming down to answer, but rather I'm interested in going to meet the sky. Okay, let's finish now. At level 2A, we can easily make observations about messages, themes here. We have a poet who is going to celebrate the complexity of life. He talks about it as the old law. He is a part of all of that life. Number 2, at 2A, he also is a poet who is going to celebrate all of the professions. Just because you work for a living at minimum wage does not make you a lesser person. Your work is every bit as important as any more celebrated kind of work. Finally, he will make the observation that he likes nature the way it is. He doesn't want to change it. He simply wants to understand it and be a part of it. Capital M, me. At 2B, we've already made several observations here. Again, Whitman loves these poetic lines of listing, these catalogings that he's often going to do. At 3A, let's ask this question. What is for you your favorite text, movie, TV show, about being outside in nature? Are you at all familiar with any film you've ever watched where this fundamental story is about coming to terms with what it is like to be in nature? Do you have a favorite film that you're familiar with where the individual has to live for a while out closer to nature, maybe on a farm or a ranch or something like that, and what that experience is like? Are you at all familiar in your films or in your video playing at all of a person who is kind of a normal person who works a normal job, we might call, right? But then has a second life other than that normal job? Think about why it's so fascinating that in many of our comic books, which have been translated into movies, we think, of course, of Batman, we think of Spider-Man, you will have a two-persona kind of person. Whitman is going to celebrate both sides, the outdoors, the people who work with cattle, as well as the people who spend time indoors. Finally, 3B, what is your view of being outside? Would you prefer to have school outdoors? Would you prefer for school to be a place, not in a classroom, but, for example, somewhere outdoors? For example, I could be giving this lecture to you right now on a ranch in Hyattville, where we got up this morning at 4 a.m. and started our rounds of chores. We worked, and then finally, 5 hours later, we took a break, ate a little breakfast, and then sat down to read this poem, and then go back out to do more work, maybe riding on horseback, working in the hayloft, how would that be for you, an education different from the schooling that you have been receiving? Do you think it would be a better idea? Whitman makes that argument. He says school is the place, not where students learn very much, but they learn how they hate school. They want to get out of school. Is there a better way to educate, do you think? Maybe in the outdoors. Another 3B question. What is for you your favorite place to be outside? Do you have a spot outside you love to go to in the mountains? Well, there you go. An introduction to Whitman's passage 1-4 of Song of Myself. Thank you.